So this is part 2 of our lecture on geography of Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is a part of what is known as Tornado Alley. And in the spring, when northern cooler air moves in and meets in the state of Oklahoma with warmer Gulf air, what is created is a mixture of high and low pressure systems that create tornadoes. And the mixing of these wind patterns creates a lot of the changing temperatures that we see in the spring. So when the wind comes from the north, it's often very cold. When it comes from the south, it's a lot warmer. When those two meet, we get weather patterns that lead to tornadoes. Oklahoma averages about 54 tornadoes per year. And as the climate is changing, it's happening sooner in the calendar year, but it's also happening in different places. So a lot of the past couple of springs, we have seen, like this past spring, we didn't have a ton of tornado activity in Oklahoma, but there was a ton of tornado activity that happened in places like Mississippi and Alabama. And as the climate of the United States is changing, so too is Tornado Alley. And so Oklahoma still is known for having severe weather and tornadoes, but it happens in Oklahoma, but it also happens in other places. And so other states are learning very quickly about what is, the result of having tornadoes is that there's a lot of damage. And so this is the part of geography affecting the history of Oklahoma, is that we are impacted by our geography because when we have severe weather, that affects businesses, that affects people that live in the state of Oklahoma as part of their history. And so we care about it, or we should care about it, because it is a part of who we are as a state. Okay. So here is a little bit of a picture of what this what happens in Tornado Alley. So we have warm, moist air, we have warm, dry air, all kind of colliding at once that lead to these tornadoes. So the red is the high pressure, the blue is the low pressure, and when those combine, it spins up into tornadoes. Oklahoma is known for its wind. It's in the state song where the wind comes sweeping down the plains. And there are negatives and there are positives to having wind in Oklahoma. The negatives are tornadoes. When it's cold wind, it is super cold in Oklahoma, like bone-chillingly cold. But it also creates problems with allergies and things when pollen gets blown into the air. What I want you to do now is pause the video, write down in your notes a couple of positives that you can come up with about wind in Oklahoma. The positives will be a part of a short answer question that you'll have on your quiz this Thursday and this Friday. So why, again, does physical geography matter? Since we can't really turn and talk to our neighbor because of the current global pandemic and moving lectures online, I want you to write it in your notebook. Why does geography matter? And then I want you to think about how many people have families, you might be one, that have family, brothers, sisters, parents, grandparents that work in oil and gas here in Tulsa. For some people, it is why they moved to Oklahoma, is because of energy. How many people have families that work in agriculture? That might be a bunch of you. That might not be any of you. But between these two things, physical geography really matters. Oil and gas and energy, that is a natural resource. That is something that comes from the ground that creates jobs in the state of Oklahoma. Farming, the same thing. When you make corn and wheat and soy, right, you pull those out of the ground and you sell it, that creates an economy in Oklahoma. So the physical land in a state like Oklahoma really matters. You might have also written down in your notes that the positives of wind is that we can create wind energy. There's a huge wind industry in western Oklahoma in the Panhandle. If you've ever driven towards New Mexico or Colorado, that is relatively new. They are massive wind farms that create an industry, and that's created as a result of the physical geography of Oklahoma, where it's located relative to the Rocky Mountains and all the wind that comes down the plains into the state. So when we think about oil, where does it come from? Typically, people think the ground, and that's true. It does come from the ground. What is it mostly comprised of? It's carbon, really. It is carbon, and you want to write that down as well. And how does carbon get underground? Well, actually, it gets underground by people dying, and organisms dying, and plants dying, and it gets pressurized. So carbon gets pressurized. And when that carbon gets pressurized underground, it creates oil. There's a lot more science that goes on into it. But oil that we use in our cars and in our, to heat our homes and to run electricity and things like that, comes from a natural, physical, organic substance. It is carbon-based. And so what happened over the course of millions of years is that things would live and they would die and they would get buried. And then when they got buried, they decomposed. And as they decomposed, they became liquid carbon, which is what we use for oil, which is why there's so much of it in the world, is because we're talking about hundreds of millions of years that this process is going through, instead of a couple hundred that we're now using oil we're pumping it out of the ground much faster than it went in, which is why it's non-renewable. So millions of years, the state of Oklahoma, particularly where a lot of oil is located, and in Texas, was underwater. And the water that it was covering the state had organisms that lived there. When they died, they sank. And when they fell to that bottom of the ocean, they're buried, and then carbon and pressure creates this oil. So this is kind of how oil comes to be all over the world, but in Oklahoma especially. Other than oil, Oklahoma has many different other resources that are super important. We've talked about wind, but we also have an ocean almost of water that is sitting underneath us in aquifers. And an aquifer is an underground waterway that usable water is stored. So when it rains, it flows and fills to the aquifer, and then the aquifer is where the water is stored, so it is able to be used, and then you can pump it out of the ground and use it. The biggest aquifer is the Ogallala aquifer, located in the Panhandle. And these aquifers are essential resources of fresh drinking water, not only for drinking for humans, but also for plants and agriculture. And that's why, again, remember that the state of Oklahoma is located in the southern plains. We have good farmland north and east of here is because we are a part of the Great Plains. And one of the reasons why we are so good at farming in Oklahoma is because we have these gigantic aquifers where we don't need to use a ton of irrigation because we have this natural resource underneath us. That is the last example of resources that we have in Oklahoma. But again, the thing to remember is physical geography matters. And the physical geography of Oklahoma matters because of all of the things that we've listed in these first two lectures matter to the state of Oklahoma.